Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here with Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic. Welcome back to the podcast, Jen.
Well, good morning, Fred. It's another cold November morning, but we keep rolling along.
Today we are welcoming Dr. Wendong Zhang, who is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at Iowa State University, to recap his presentation during the virtual Ag Lenders Seminar held earlier in November. Dr. Zhang is a native of Northeast China who led the development of the new interactive Iowa farmland portal, as well as co-founded the new ISU China Ag Center in collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. Dr. Zhang received his PhD in Agriculture, Environment, and Development Economics from The Ohio State University in July of 2015, and he also holds a BSc in Environmental Science from Fudan University in China. Welcome to the program, Dr. Zhang.
Good morning, Fred and Jan. I'm afraid you just promoted me to associate professor. I'm in the process of getting my tenure application, so I hope that's a verdict on that case. But thanks for joining everyone.
Dr. Zhang, just how important are exports to American agriculture, especially trade with China?
So when we are looking at U.S. agriculture production, roughly 20% of the total value of ag products goes to global markets. So roughly 20% of the value of agricultural production is driven by exports. And among all the trading partners, China is very important. So in fact, that before the trade war, China is competing with Canada for the top one spot every year. So on average, we sell about $20 to $25 billion of products to China every year. And especially important for Midwestern states like Iowa, because soybean accounts for almost half of the exports to China. One of the vivid sayings that I heard is that you can think of that every one in four rows of soybean crops grown in Iowa will eventually go to China before the trade war. So that's how significant those are. And when we are thinking about the packing plants and the other capacities, these investments are often more geared towards to tailor the global demand, rising global demand, rather than the rising consumption inside the United States.
And Dr. Zhang, concerning the economic and trade agreement with China, are we meeting those targets for the phase one? I know you sent me an updated message about the policy brief, kind of an update on that phase one. What in particular does this mean for our dairy producers?
Yeah, so when it comes to the phase one deal, just to recap, essentially US and China signed the phase one trade deal in January 15th earlier this year, before the pandemic. As part of it, China agreed to buy $12.5 billion more relative to the 2017 baseline for the calendar year of 2020. So essentially, instead of buying $22 billion, China promised to buy about $36 billion of agricultural products from the US for 2020. You mentioned our policy brief. As part of that policy brief, if you go to card.iostate.edu, I'm part of the Center for Agricultural Rural Development at CARD. So we have a new policy brief, which we predicted China will be able to meet the bulk of the commitment. So China will be able to purchase about $31.5 billion out of the $35 billion target. This is still falling behind based on the current pace, but it's a substantial improvement. If we just look at the first half of the year, the Chinese purchase, they are only on track to buy about $22 billion rather than $31 billion. So over the past few months, they have done dramatic increase in terms of the purchases. The notable commodities are mainly in corn, pork, beef are all posting record sales. Dairy is not as strong as the other products, but what is interesting is that the infant formulas is also counted as the agricultural products in this phase one deal as well.
It sounds like there are big winners in this trade deal for U.S. agriculture. Are there other winners?
So when you are thinking about the winners, in our projections, I think the two brackets currently really stand out. One is the feed grains, so it's corn and sorghum, and another one is protein. So this is beef and pork. So one of the major reasons is not necessarily related to the phase one deal, it's actually related to the internal market dynamics in China, because China had African swine fever since August 2018, which wiped out eventually 40% of their hog inventory. So their loss is larger than the entire US inventory. Right? So to give you some understanding of the scale, Iowa has a third of the US pigs, and China essentially has about 6 times of the entire US inventory. So the loss is larger than the entire US inventory. So as part of the rebuilding efforts, they need a whole lot more feed grains, and because they're still falling behind as the pre-African swine fever level by at least 15 to 20%. So they still need to import a whole lot more proteins. And what is also beneficial for the US is Germany, our key competitor, also found African swine fevers in October, so which give us more room to expand our exports.
As they bring their pig industry online, whey is a pretty important part of that feed formula. So that'll help dairy producers, correct?
Yes. So you do see some more purchase of, say, barley and some wheat too, but when it comes to wheat, the Chinese authorities are more cautious because wheat and rice are more regarded as critical self-sufficient food crops that they want to maintain really high self-sufficiency ratio. So in general, they don't want to be massively involved in imports of these products, except probably for some specialty products with high gluten level or some other things.
Yeah, given that, how do you think the U.S. producers are viewing this as far as the impact on their farms? You know, what is their outlook?
We have done research. We have done surveys in 2019 in the spring. We have asked about the perception of U.S.-China trade war among Midwest crop producers. In general, I think on the one hand that the 56% of the farmers are supportive or strongly supportive of President Trump's tariffs to be imposed on China, right? And recognizing more than 3/4 of them recognize this will actually cause at least short-term negative income shocks to their farm. But they are hoping for a short-term pain, long-term gain. And many of them are hoping for more expanded long-term trade relationship with China, and that this will be resolved in a way that benefits the U.S. agriculture eventually. I think one of the things that especially since the last year, that many producers have recognized that how significant the trade to China is to commodity markets and farm income. When you're looking at over the past few months where we see huge rallies of the commodity markets, both for corn, soybean prices, a lot of them are driven by really strong and record level imports from China. And if you take those out, and that will be really detrimental to the farm income.
In your presentation at the Ag Lenders Seminar, you talked about a comparative advantage for U.S. ag. What do you mean by that?
When we are thinking about the U.S.-China agricultural relations, I think that the China cannot. So this is a mutually beneficial relationship, and from China's perspective, China cannot be self-sufficient and go essentially go without the United States because that China has limited resources. Just to give you one example, that China has 20% of the world's population, so 1.4 billion people, but only 7 to 9% of the arable land. Well, the US ratio is we have less than 4% of the world's population, but close to 15% of the arable land. So that alone is a 6 times difference. So that means that China cannot be self-sufficient in all the commodities. They essentially made strategic decisions to allocate the scarce land resources to wheat, rice, as I talked about. Those are regarded as critical food crops. They're also reserving acres for vegetables and corn as well. So what they're giving up is feed grains such as soybeans and the land-intensive animal production, for example, cattle, right? So they still want to maintain a really large, the hog herd, because pork represents over 60% of the meat that Chinese people eat. So they have different priorities for when it comes to the commodity mix. And I think that U.S. has a whole lot of potential when it comes to the land-intensive commodity agricultural commodities, such as the protein products and the feed grains. And also, if we expand our view from the US Midwest to the coastal area, US also is very competitive in nuts, fruits, and vegetables. That arguably has a much less share in the Chinese food imports, that US can do much better in that arena.
And Dr. Zhang, it seems like with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a lot of changes with a lot of things in the last couple of months, but what hasn't changed? What's remained kind of constant?
2 things, one probably good, one probably is not so good. One thing that is beneficial for the US agricultural exports is that China represents really significant market that is growing both in terms of income, but also in terms of food consumption, especially higher quality food consumption like proteins and specialty products like nuts and avocados and cherries and potentially dairy products, right? So those are some of the growth opportunities as you look ahead that the Brookings Institute forecast. There will be 350 million new middle class for the next decade in China, which earning about $20,000 at a household income, right? So that represents an important, robust, and growing market. What is not so good is China probably will continue its diversification away from the United States, especially when it comes to soybeans. Arguably, the trade war has created even more strategic incentives. As we are celebrating the commodity rallies in the US, China also bought record levels of soybeans from Brazil in May and in June. So when we are thinking about our projections for how much soybeans China will buy this year from us, it will be on par to the 2017 level, slightly lower. So it's about less than $12 billion. So it's not seeing the same dramatic increases as the pork, beef, and corn, for example. And arguably, I think that China is probably trying to diversify that. The Brazilian currency also depreciated over 20% earlier this year. So that also helped their competitiveness in the global market earlier as well.
You talked about China's consumption and future trends for China's dairy market. I know we mentioned whey goes into the baby pig formula, but what other products are out there in the future? Can you highlight what you see?
Yeah, so I think the dairy market is a really interesting one that probably we need to think out of the box, in the sense that we cannot just think that the Chinese people typically doesn't eat the same portfolio when it comes to the dairy products like the United States. Well, I mentioned in the presentation, I had no idea what cottage cheese is 3 years ago until my then 3-year-old came home from daycare asking for it, right? So because we typically in China, we don't grow up eating these products and never seen cheese curds before coming to the United States. And so fresh milk actually represents the probably 2/3 of the dairy consumption. what is promising is when you are thinking about that the people like my parents' generation in the 50s and 60s, they probably only have one serving of milk or dairy products on a weekly basis. But when you look at the current teenagers in China, they're having more than one glass of milk a day. And often, even in a rural area, the Chinese government is paying for them. So that's changing the preferences fundamentally. There's another thing is that a lot of the people in China are lactose intolerant, like my mom-in-law. So she always thought that dairy products doesn't agree with her until that she came to Ames so she tried lactate and actually really like it, and it's fine. So, but when you go to except you go to some of the fancier shops in Shanghai, in the most urban cities in China, it's really hard to find those specialty products, right? So those are some of the growth opportunities. Not only infant formulas, even that there are people who are, I know Kevin Kimberly in my department talking about some of the Chinese merchants coming to Iowa thinking about setting up goat farm, because that the goat milk or the goat milk powders are thought as beneficial when after the women give birth to their child, then it's regarded as one of the nutrition forces that you can replenish yourself after that. So there are some products that we don't necessarily consume a whole lot that potentially has a whole lot of traction. Another thing I think is important is to start these negotiations, because that now otherwise that our competitors from New Zealand and Netherlands and Germany are expanding rapidly in the fresh milk and yogurt and in these dairy markets in China.
Thanks for providing that perspective, Dr. Zhang. I think that really helps give an understanding of the growth of the dairy products and what potential there could be. During the Ag Lenders seminar, you also made some observations concerning how the new U.S. administration may deal with trade. Can you outline what those changes you think we'll see?
Yeah, so before I talk about that, so it's actually quite a fascinating development. Even yesterday, China actually led a trade pact called RCEP, Regional Cooperative Economic. So RCEP is it's one of the China-led trade agreements that consists all the southeastern countries, the 10 countries from Southeast Asia, plus Japan, Korea, South Korea, China, and New Zealand, and Australia. So this represents 30% of the GDP. And what is notable is US is not part of it, right? So this is sort of the important counter move that China thought of and started 8 years ago, along with the Southeastern partners, as the US is trying to create the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Agreement, right? So one of the potential movements in the trade arena under a future Biden administration might be reconsidering joining the CPTPP, as President Trump pulled out in 2017. Right, so that will potentially be beneficial for U.S. agricultural exports, because this will give us a preferential access to a lot of the important trading partners like Japan and others. Another thing is, I think that we probably need to lower our expectations that President like Biden on the campaign trail talked once about potentially lowering tariffs or removing tariffs as part of the U.S.-China trade war. But I think that a lot of the advisors and himself walked back from these statements. So when you think about his legislative priorities, I think in the foreign policy arena, rejoining the Paris Accord on climate change and potentially reconsidering the agreement with Iran on the nuclear proliferation probably takes more priorities when it comes to than the trade agreements with China. But there are discussions of potentially the new administration might be taking more multilateral approach, joining forces with the allies rather than trying to strike bilateral trade deals. From the China's point of view, there's definitely interest in renegotiating the trade deal, but I think we probably won't see that very soon. And those renegotiation could take a long time, as the new administration might also focus more on labor standards and environmental standards when it's related to trade practices more than a Republican president as well.
Dr. Zhang, would you I know you do a lot of research with land values and stuff. Can you give us a quick outline of some of the research you're doing?
I currently actually leading the ISU Land Value Survey. We are doing the survey now, so please tune in and watch for the release on December 15th, Tuesday at 10. We'll be releasing the 2020 Land Value Survey results. Based on a lot of the information we gathered, typically we will see a stable, probably even slightly improving land market, especially in light of the infusions of government payments and improvements in commodity prices. I also do a survey called the Farmland Ownership and Tenure Survey, just to give you some general idea that what we find is, for example, over 80% of the land in Iowa are fully paid for. When you are 2/3 of the land are owned by people who are 65 or older. So you can all find the information on the ISU Farmland portal that Fred mentioned earlier at card.iastate.edu/farmland. And if you have questions, feel free to get in touch with me.
Thanks for all the great information here today, Dr. Zhang. And as we conclude, I do want to note that we do have lots of information on our Extension Dairy Team website. Plus, we will include the link with this recorded podcast. Thank you for being on this podcast, Dr. Zhang, and thank you for being part of it, Jen.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to visiting with you on our next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.